Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. A lecture by Maria Lisogorskaya of Reusable. This is as you may know, our lectures are sponsored by various sponsors. This one is a historic preservation lecture. And so a special thanks to Esley Hamilton for helping to expand ideas of how we preserve and reuse buildings. So Maria is one of the founding directors of Reusable, which is a London-based practice. I have to say, Reusable is a really great name. I don't know if you pay attention to kind of firm names, but in particular because it describes both how they're organized and also kind of the activities they perform. And so they were formed in 2010 by a series of classmates and kind of started out with a really informal organization. They kind of operate as a democratic, multidisciplinary collective working across architecture, art, and design, and often community-based projects. The work really ranges a broad range of scale, from urban strategy to architecture to more industrial design and kind of product scale of design. You could say they started Reusable to realize their own ideas. I think that echoes, students and young architects' frustration with the profession, with kind of working for other people and wanting to explore your own ideas. And so they started to kind of take things into their own hands and started to build things themselves. And through that process, it's a lot of kind of hands-on learning, but learning through material exploration and really getting hands-on materials. I'd say this kind of requires just a degree of optimism, right? That you'll be able to figure out things and figure out problems along the way. I think it's a really important part of being a young architect. Reusable kind of follows in a rich history of collectives. Team 10 is probably one of the really well-known collectives kind of from the late 60s. With architects like Aldo van Eyck, Allison and Peter Smithson, George Candelas, Jaap Bakema. But also, there are other, I think, really important examples like Team Zoo out of Japan in the 1970s. And EAT, which is Experiments in Experiments in Art and Technology. Probably best known for their Osaka pavilion in 1970. And that was a group of artists and engineers, less architects, only maybe one or two architects. And if you haven't seen the Osaka Pepsi pavilion, definitely check it out. More recently, I think collectives in terms of mass design, doing some really interesting work in Africa, and also Raumlabor, Berlin-based collaborative that actually had they did a piece in the Pulitzer Foundation in 2016. So with that, we can learn more about Reusable, and please help me welcome Lisogorskaya. Sorry, Maria Lisogorskaya. You probably get that all the time.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that introduction, Chandler. It's great to have a kind of cultural context to our work, because we're definitely not the only collective out there. Thanks for coming to the lecture. I know it's an important day in the calendars for you guys, but so I appreciate you being here. And thank you to Esley Hamilton for the generous support, but also for helping me to frame this presentation, which is about historical preservation. So I've tried to think about historical preservation And, it's an interesting word. We all know what it means. But it's both an action of preserving something and a state of being preserved. And I was thinking about today, Halloween, and trying to get inspired and themed, looking at some crazy costumes from the 1900s, but also thinking about the kind of beliefs around the Halloween culture and this idea of, bringing the dead, celebrating harvest and bringing the dead to our domain, thinking about how we connect to the past. And it's present in our culture, but also many other cultures, including, things that connect to the Day of the Dead in Mexico and beyond. And I read this paragraph when reading about Halloween. I don't know much about Halloween, but I was reading about it, and I like this paragraph about the importance of kind of the comfort that connection to the ghosts and spirits of the past gives us as a way of understanding what to do going forward. And just thinking about preservation, I guess, in terms of architectural preservation, you have, preservation of ancient ruins and castles and things like that, which we're all familiar with. But I guess that's not something I've worked on very much on, but something we do think about in our practice is preservation of, obviously, physical structures. How do you reuse buildings and materials? Preservation of culture of a place, language, programmatic use, all the things you're thinking about as students. Memory, imagery, a spirit of a place, whatever that means. I guess preservation of possibility for the future. And just thinking again about architecture and historical preservation, essentially it's other people's decisions and resources. And at times we live with them and learn from them, like being in this building was designed by a famous architect, Maki, I think it was one of his first early buildings in the 60s. But sometimes preserving spaces isn't relevant anymore, like you've seen with all the, taking down of monuments post-2020. So, I'll just talk about my work now. But important thing is the learning from others, and something that I try to do with my students when I'm teaching. So this is a project we did in EPFL Lausanne, where we were learning from stone construction. And we got the students to sort of copy and rebuild at model scale some of kind of a range of stone buildings. So for example, this one, which is a church made of stone, and one of the things that the students focused in this 1 to 10 model is the marks left from scaffolding. So obviously to build stone back in the day, you needed different kind of technology, and understanding that what looks beautiful and ornamental now is just a kind of mark of a previous historical construction. Similarly, looking at this building in Arles in France, which has remained as this shell of a Roman amphitheatre, actually at some point was inhabited and lived in as a village. And this really incredible typology in this kind of Scotland called the Black Houses, which is a sort of nomadic settlement type where people don't have many resources and build very low-rise stone buildings. And students interpreted that construction, which is all about using stone to weigh down a fibre roof. And also looking at somewhere like Hagia Sophia, which not only has been preserved as an incredible architectural monument, but also has had a lot of change, being a church, a mosque, a museum, and then a mosque again. So, in our practice, we have tried to have preservation, thinking about structures, materials, skills, people, practices, land. And as a collective, we have been evolving as a practice. As Chandler was saying, we started very informally, just having met at university. We all got other jobs after graduation, but then we worked part-time to sort of try things out ourselves because we felt frustrated just kind of designing toilet details. Where at university you have so much freedom to think about things, and then you get stuck in a job and it's not quite the same. So I'll just talk through a few projects thinking about this idea of historic preservation. So one one of our early projects was kind of about preservation of a cultural fantasy. So the project was a cinema that we built ourselves in a petrol station. This was like 12 years ago, a long time. And it sort of came about from seeing all these empty petrol stations out in the city. And there was a 2008 financial crash, and there was a few across the country. And then also having this sort of imaginative leap to images of Ed Ruscha in the States, kind of at petrol stations as a iconic image, especially in California and other parts of the US. Something that we don't actually have a connection to in the UK in the same way, but we made that kind of fantasy leap as designers. And also, again, a historical preservation of an idea of a cinema and as a kind of palace, a cinema as a glamorous experience, which again, we haven't experienced ourselves, but have seen through research and images online. And so we tried to transform this existing structure to something which felt a bit like some of the images I showed you. And the idea was that, we had this kind of performative experience of lifting the curtain up at the end of each film. And the films that we screened, we curated ourselves, were a lot of them were kind of American road movies, because we didn't have much sound insulation, and so we thought, well, that could add to this sort of the sound of the cars in the films, the sound of the cars in the street. A lot of it was trying to recreate this kind of glamour of the curtain with very industrial or cheap materials that we had access to. So at the time it was this roofing company, Tyvek. They gave us a lot of materials for free or sponsored the project, and we went into their warehouse and tried different types of folding techniques, trying to recreate this idea of a grand curtain. And we also worked with an amazing organization called the Cinema Museum, who are all about preserving kind of cinema culture, like posters and old velvet chairs. And we borrowed some of those chairs for the structure for the project. We also looked at sort of marquetry and kind of decorative furniture and remade it using kind of cheap Formica. And a couple of the girls, they had a job at a sort of large commercial architecture practice, and they used their laser cutter to cut these out in the evenings. So be smart about the resources you have access to. Then I guess there's historic preservation of character. So I had an idea of working with an existing building, both being a nightmare logistically, but also opportunity to have character that you wouldn't be able to kind of create yourself all in one go. So this is a project we did in London, which was converting an old baths building into a contemporary centre for art. It was part of the Goldsmiths University and attached to that campus. And so, you can see some of the Victorian brick building, existing building, which we worked within and also added to. And this is the old baths, which kind of have been disused for many years. One of the methods in which we worked is kind of studying the building through photography, drawings, but also making large-scale models, which allowed to really get a sense of scale and also a sense of texture and contrast. And an important thing for us was thinking about the art gallery as not a white cube, no pun intended, not a white room only, but also a kind of a journey, an experience of various types of spaces, because it happens to be in this building which has a different kind of history. And so working with the tanks, the oil tanks, and transforming them into exhibition space, and also kind of different heights and different types of treatments and different lighting as well, which allows for different kinds of work to be exhibited. So some more climate-controlled rooms, but some tall spaces which allow for kind of larger sculpture, and also kind of load-bearing floors which allow for heavy things, big things, and messy things. And we also built an extension to the existing building, and that we sort of worked a lot with sort of prototyping a one-to-one scale. So this is a one-to-one model of a facade that we built which is using sort of industrial concrete corrugated tiles and using them as a facade rain screen. And this is it in the final building, the finished building, which opened a few years ago. Another type, or another way of looking at historic preservation is preserving something which is unseen or overlooked. So one project we worked on, actually our first proper commission as a sort of a practice, where we took part in an architectural competition and won, which was amazing. It was a kind of a refurbishment of a town centre in the outskirts of London, in Croydon. And one thing we found whilst being there, the brief was really all about kind of bringing it back to life, because there wasn't much going on. It's quite a bleak town centre. And what we found is that there's a lot going on in kind of hidden spaces all over the town centre, kind of private higher rooms or little kind of people's homes or whatever. And so we put on a few events which explored all that is happening in private, and then kind of that allowed that to inform what we design in the public realm. And if it's kind of informal skate areas, how do we incorporate that into public realm? And also just, I guess, making it nice with trees and seating and things like that. This is a map for kind of a research project we did in East London, which was looking at the changing area, the changing nature of the neighbourhoods from kind of industrial to residential. And one of the kind of narratives that, we heard a lot from development there is that it's a wasteland, or, there's nothing, we're building this new place. But actually, there was something there before. And by creating this drawing, this map of what is there now, it kind of gives place to, it gives a voice or an image to something, and potentially helps to preserve it or not, I don't know. But it's an interesting exercise, because there was, obviously, as you can see, a lot going on. I think the blue was like industrial, then there was the yellows, small businesses. I can't remember now, but, from informal radio stations to large set builders, workshops, to kind of all sorts of food distribution, things like that. So, yeah. Then a kind of, more in-depth piece of work has been our involvement in Liverpool, which is England. And it's an area called Granby, which is sort of known and has historically been a very diverse area and kind of home to a lot of immigrant culture and really kind of lively Victorian and kind of dense Victorian streets with a lot of commercial on the ground floor. But there was a lot of, it was part of a kind of clearance program that was happening across the UK, which was complicated, but partially to do with trying to create more suburban environments where, more suburban environments, but basically where kind of old dense streets, Victorian streets, kind of lost a lot of their value, and the planners at the time thought the good idea was to kind of erase a lot of the homes and build kind of more suburban homes. But what happened is that the scheme was partially complete and didn't have enough money to really do it properly, and a lot of the houses were kind of bought up and boarded up, but then just standing empty for decades. So you can see one of the examples of the streets. And some of the residents, although a majority had to leave, some of them remained. And you can see kind of the humorous graffiti trying to keep the area going. But even recently, you can see there's like kind of mistakes made by the planning authority where things are just demolished randomly. And over time, there was a kind of understanding that it wasn't necessarily the best urban planning decision. And with the political change, the Granby Four Streets Community Land Trust, which was set up by residents there, kind of was was able to gain more power. But until then, they were doing a lot of kind of things themselves, like trying to clean up the streets when the rubbish collectors wouldn't come. They would paint their houses. Really, just the few remaining people left in those streets took charge of their environment. And they were planting on the streets, and they also set up a local market. And then when we met them at that stage, they were able to renovate 10 houses, and they kind of got ownership of that. And so we worked with them to think about how to do that in the best way. And we did a kind of study, like a book, trying to just understand what's going on, photographing each property, looking at different types of housing that you could fit there. And the problem was that the houses are in such bad condition that some of the buildings, would be too expensive to turn them into housing. So we were also looking at kind of commercial and other uses that could be present there. So it's like a mini master plan. And so with the housing, it was very low budget. And so it was all about trying to retain some of that Victorian character, kind of exposing the roofs and the chimneys, just really simple, insulating it basically, and bringing more light into the buildings, which are a bit pokey. And then with the other ones which weren't in really bad condition, they couldn't really, be turned into homes. We thought about kind of creating a winter garden, kind of social spaces, which is a bit ambitious with this tropical image, but it did get built in the end by bringing kind of two units together and reinforcing the brick, and then working with horticultural community there to build the winter garden, and that's in use still now. These are some of the images of that renovation. And then when we were designing the homes, again, very low budget, we wanted to try and bring in something special which would give back some of the value to the homes that had so much value stripped out. And so we used some of the demolition waste in creating kind of new products that each home would have, which are these fireplaces now called Granby Rock. So using a lot of demolition waste and pigment and cement to create something which might have history in it, embedded in the new homes. And each house had this. And then as part of the process of renovating the homes and kind of making these special additions like the fireplaces, but also other things like tiles and doorknobs and kind of special shelving, we set up a kind of social enterprise called Granby Workshop. And the idea is that they would produce a lot of the things that would go into the houses, but also beyond, and kind of use that energy to create a local business. And the kind of first collection came out in 2015, which was all about really kind of hands-on and low-cost materials, and didn't require too much technical infrastructure in terms of equipment. And it was exhibited at the Turner Prize exhibition, and the idea was to kind of get all the press and interest in the project to kind of bring back money into the area by starting up that business. And since then it's grown and become an independent ceramics manufacturer, kind of selling tiles, but also working on projects kind of across the UK and beyond, and focusing on ceramics. One of the projects we did was in New York, kind of exploring this idea of an extruded tile. And so this was like a installation. And then another one which was using kind of a ram press technique. So using kind of adding new equipment to speed up the handmade process. And then now the workshop is focusing on recycled ceramics. So looking at how to make 100% recycled glaze and working with specialists in that. So another lens is historic preservation of materials and skills. So thinking about reuse of materials, but also people that know how to work with them. So this is working in France, in the south of France, in Arles, And it's a large park which used to be a train depot. And you can see at the bottom there's a Gary building which opened only a year ago. And then at the top, some of the kind of warehouse type buildings is one of them that we're working in. So this is it from the outside. You can see it's like a kind of stone shell where the roof's sort of fallen through, and all the windows and doors are gone. With this iconic building in the back, and you can see that we're basically using the shell, but building self-sufficient structures inside, because it's a historical building and it can't really be relied on or touched very much, and everything needs to be insulated, but it just creates a boundary to work with. And so this is a model, 150 model we've been using for the last 3 years to sort of work kind of iteratively on the design. And the building is going to be kind of new labs and workshops for an experimental materials lab called Atelier Luma. And the idea is that it's all about kind of working with regional materials and waste materials in a quite agricultural part of France, where there's a lot of sort of sunflowers and rice and a lot of kind of fiber waste, but also quarries, stone and clay quarries and things like that. So one of the things we did was reuse the old tiles from the building, which had to be replaced, and turn them into a terrazzo floor in one of the lab buildings. So this is it being laid. Another aspect is kind of thinking about sound insulation and using kind of waste from the agriculture, like the sunflowers and the rice, in the render. And so we're collaborating with the Atelier and Belgian architects called BC on this project. And then using, kind of natural insulation and also, this is Atelier Luma's experiments with kind of eco leather, using all this stuff. It's quite funny. And lots of aspects to this project, which include kind of invasive plant dyes and algae and all that stuff. We're also looking at rammed earth. So this is kind of a public workshop that was run by BC, looking at kind of different types of rammed earth and like natural plaster. And then this is a one-to-one prototype we made of a rammed earth wall for the building. And we're also looking a lot at stone quarries, because it's such a important part of the landscape there. There's loads and loads of limestone quarries in the region, and the Romans built a lot. I mean, the majority of the buildings in town are stone, and there's still kind of a lot of knowledge about how to work with it, but it hasn't been so prevalent in the construction, even though stone is actually a very ecological material compared to concrete. So we've been going to lots of quarries and meeting with stonemasons and kind of working at various scales. So there's a scale of furniture where we found a lot of these stone cores in quarries that have been taken out, because when people specify kind of stone columns, they can't rely on the calculation, because the stone is a natural material. So they often fill it with concrete, and so they have to core out the stone, and then you have this waste. And so we reuse this in a kind of composite sink thing. This is a 1-to-10 model it's a plaster model, but thinking about there's lots of stone waste in the quarries, and thinking about also this idea of coring and what happens to that, and how we can build like a column and beam structure with this idea. This is the rammed earth wall on site now. Oh yeah, and this is one of the spaces that's almost done, and that's using that's indigo stained timber construction, and then with the kind of the funky sound insulated walls. Oh yeah, this is the sink. I guess maybe the final project which I'll talk about is this idea of historic preservation of cultural capital. So we're working in New Orleans with this organization called Material Institute. It's an experimental free art school, which has only started up a few years ago. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the fashion and textiles department, which we sort of helped to start. And the idea really is thinking about the incredible heritage of craft and fashion and textile design in New Orleans, such as, I don't know if you know about this cultural black masking from Mardi Gras. If you don't, check it out. But all of this incredible suit is hand sewn, and the imagery that you see at the front is all beadwork. And incredible fashion. This is caramel curves on the left and second line on the right. And then the kind of the broader picture of the South. So this is G's Bent quilts from North Carolina. So there's a lot of heritage, but there isn't a kind of fashion design school in New Orleans, and there was a lot of kind of interest in having one and having a workshop where people can explore and design. And so currently, the latest kind of stage is that there's a one-year curriculum program which includes kind of various aspects. But essentially, the kind of bigger vision is this idea of having access to kind of production and making your own textiles, and this idea of kind of growing and having access to the land, which produces these final garments. And so some of the equipment that's available is kind of knitting machines and large printing presses, and a studio which is accessible for free to the students. And some of the stuff that they do is kind of, natural dyeing, knitting, and also there's a new development in kind of connection to local industries. So this is a denim mill, which is like a half an hour drive or an hour drive. And they've started to kind of use a lot of waste material from the mill, but also thinking about how kind of design education can connect to the industry in terms of kind of getting jobs, but also innovation of the design. And some of the stuff that people make, and this is, just bear in mind, I guess, this was made by someone who's never ever studied design before, and within a few months of being in the program, kind of making a pair of trousers through weaving waste denim. A lot of kind of indigo dyeing and sewing, draping. This is a project we did in collaboration with them for Chicago Biennale 2019, where they made all sorts of things using tufting guns. So garments, but also there was like a giant tent that was tufted for the exhibition. And this is a corset made of recycled tires. And this is the space. I guess the important thing about that place is just the space given to make a mess and experiment and try things out in a non-pressured way, which I think is really important. So thank you.
I'm like kind of thinking about like confused about like when we do like historical preservation, and what if we like imagine like some of these townhouses was actually like it's in very bad conditions, and you like give a contemporary new life to it, and does it still like what's the thing like we preserve actually is like the objectivity of this townhouse, or it's like the function of this, and which like also like what is like the more essential to it? Like, is it the function or the objectivity or the meanings of it? I guess I'm curious about like your precision on this question. I know it's like really broad.
No, it's a really good question because, yeah, like practically speaking, preserving buildings like that isn't practical, or it might be easier in some ways to just start new because it's so complicated to like fit in the insulation and all the kind of work with the existing thing. So I think like sometimes maybe it doesn't make sense depending on the context, but I think with this project, yeah, I think a lot of it, I think it's both symbolic and practical because, yeah, the symbolism of that area being so kind of badly treated meant that those buildings that remained felt very important symbolically. So to keep them and to kind of persevere with the activism of the local population was very important. But also because they were built in a different time, they had a lot of character which would be hard to replicate because there was a lot of, I didn't show it here, but kind of new buildings, the kind of more suburban ones next door, which, looked pretty grim because they were just, it's just cheap construction, cheap contemporary construction can be a little bit depressing. And so to have that texture of the brick and the detail, maybe it's a little bit English and tweed, but, people enjoy having that history. But I think, yeah, in terms of just pure practical construction, yeah, it's a lot of work to do that, and a lot of design work, a lot of like finding the right contractors and the right materials. But it's also more ecological to try and keep the buildings because to tear something down, to take that rubbish somewhere, trash, that is bad for the environment. So I think it's complex, yeah, and I don't think this is how you should do every single project. It's just, it made a lot of sense there.
So, most architects don't work with materials hands-on. What's the benefit for you doing that?
Well, I think firstly it's fun because if you just sit at your desk on the computer all the time, I just think you sort of morphing into a different type of creature. I think we are supposed to be moving around and being, touching things and feeling things, and I think it's just important on that. It's like going to the gym or something. But I think in terms of your practice as an architect, you also, you can understand how something's made in theory, but when you see it, when you look at it, you just get a different kind of understanding, a much deeper understanding. I can't really explain, but I'm sure you've seen it before. I don't know, in anything you do, really. So I think it's a really important learning tool. And obviously, you don't have to become the world's best, carpenter or something. That's not expected of you. But when you've seen different types of timber, even in flesh, like the different grains, the different density and the different way that they react to moisture or oil or whatever, you just get a lot more ideas. So it's not something you can really replicate. Maybe one day there'll be some kind of 3D, 4D, whatever experience, but I don't believe in it yet.
Further to that question, and this probably only like two questions like pragmatics, but I think I'm interested in like understanding the relationship between like yourself as a practice and the client in that responsibility making. I think a lot of firms move away from that because it's so cost prohibitive, and it's a struggle to get the clients to kind of be involved in that process or want to allow that process to happen. So do you guys position yourselves as like, this is something we do, and this is why people are attracted to you because you're engaging and attracting those clients? Or is that something you constantly like pushing back on? Or is it something that you just take on as a cost to the firm, not the firm, but collectively?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a very valid question. Like, I think, it's all of those things, actually. I think because of the way we started, where we had a bit of a DIY spirit, I think people go to us because of that. So that's good. But then also sometimes, we do bear the cost. Just the fact that it takes so much longer when you're making a big model, it can do anyway, but sometimes we just say, well, this is what I want to do, or like spend longer in the studio. But sometimes it's, we've been lucky with good clients. And then sometimes it's about doing it and then showing it to someone, and then they understand the value of when they see it. Because again, until you see something, you might not think it's worth it. Yeah.
So you talked about all these lenses of like how you see preservation, and each one can kind of cross over, but each one is also kind of a decision about foregoing preserving something else to preserve a different thing. And so I was just curious how you start to make those decisions, especially when you're starting to work pretty internationally. Like the culture of preservation in England is, I think, fairly different than what we have in the United States. And so how does that start to influence those decisions?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think maybe it's sometimes it's practical. So like in New Orleans, it just made sense to kind of, so spatially it's a kind of in an old car garage, and so it made sense to sort of just be there because it's probably budget constraint. I think, I don't know, I think it's a conversation with the clients, but I feel like generally maybe there is a bit of an internal ethos where we try to, where possible, preserve or understand what's there and what's good about what's there first before making a decision to get rid of it. So I think that's probably something that we project wherever we go, and then it's a conversation with the clients, trying to understand what's important to them. I think it's kind of finding our way around it, really. But we haven't done so many projects abroad where we've had to work with an existing building that is permanent. So we have worked abroad. So like there's a project we did in Japan, for example, but it was a kind of a new thing next to an old thing. We haven't been in that situation yet. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the community, I guess. I think the community feeling comes from maybe the people that we work with, because often our direct clients are communities or community reps, say. But for example, in the art school project, our client is the head of the university or whatever, the head of the art school, and then the art students that are in that university, there's different communities with it. There's so many complex communities, and I think some students maybe didn't like what we were doing because it was sort of changing their way of using the space. Some people liked it because it allowed them to show work in an interesting way. So I think community is complicated because there's many communities in any situation. Again, I think in New Orleans, I think the community of students that use the space love it because it allows them to use the space. I think maybe some of the neighbours might get annoyed because the students are there late and making noise and bring extra attention to somewhere. So I think it's complex. So obviously when I'm showing you a lecture, I'm like talking about the people that I'm working with directly, but I don't have the full understanding really of everyone. But yeah, I think the community is. It's important for us to engage with the people that reach out to us and listen to what they have to say. So I think that's where that dialogue comes in.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you for the lecture.
Thanks.